Alright, kids. So, here's the video I promised you. I spent a long time last night typing it up, and I basically decided to go area by area so you guys don't get confused with episodes. So first we're going to start off at the Wall. Jon Snow is struggling in his role in the Night's Watch after Mance Rayder's attack on the Wall, and after Ygritte's death. Obviously, he's grieving. And the Watch themselves are in a very precarious position as well, as there's no Lord Commander after Lord Mormont, the Old Bear, was killed at Craster's Keep last season. Now, King Stannis, who rescued the Watch after the Wildlings attacked last season, is pressuring them to choose a new Lord Commander, preferably someone for him to control, because he wants the Watch as his backup army. Now, Sam speaks up for Jon Snow during the auditions for Lord Commander. And even though Jon's not much liked, Sam makes it very clear that during the attack on the Wildlings, it was Jon Snow who saved all of their asses. And obviously, his speech was very convincing because it garnered exactly half of the votes needed for Jon Snow to become the next Lord Commander. And Maester Aemon was the final tally, who voted for Jon, making him the newest commander of the Night's Watch. Jon then declined Stannis' offer of legitimizing him, or making him a legal heir instead of a bastard-born man, because A, he's the new Lord Commander and has new vows that he needs to fulfill, and B, because he knew that as Lord Commander, or as Lord of Winterfell, he would be pledged to Stannis and therefore would be a pawn in Stannis' play for the Iron Throne. After this tiff, Melisandre, the Red Woman, tries to seduce Jon in order to create a baby inside of her that she can birth like a shadow child, like she did in Season 2, in order to help her raise the stone dragons from Dragonstone and win the war against the White Walkers beyond the Wall. Obviously, she fails because Jon Snow doesn't want any of that. And meanwhile, Sam is desperately trying to find some written words in the library at the Watch regarding the White Walkers and how to defeat them. Unfortunately, he's unable to find anything other than that dragonglass or obsidian, which is in abundance at Dragonstone, where Stannis lives right now. Other than the fact that that obsidian will kill the White Walkers, but not the others. You have to burn the others. White Walkers you can kill with the obsidian, just like Sam did earlier this season. Now, during this most recent episode, we also see Jon negotiating with Tormund Giantsbane, who's the wildling he was talking to at the beginning of the episode, in order to negotiate that Tormund will go beyond the Wall, find the rest of the wildlings, and bring them back south of the Wall. Jon plans to settle them in the Gift, which is fallow lands that are right below the Wall, and to protect them from the White Walkers that inevitably will come for them. Jon Snow and Tormund make a deal that Jon will go, they will take Stannis' ships, rescue the wildlings, and bring them back. And at the end of the episode, we see Stannis kind of upset that Jon's not going with him to Winterfell, and also kind of resigned to the fact that he's not going to have the Night's Watch as his backup army. So, hopefully that was clear. Moving on, we're going to go a little further south to the north and to Winterfell. Littlefinger is in the process of traveling with Sansa, who has dyed her hair dark as a disguise, but it's not really working because she looks exactly the same. And they're coming from the Eyrie when they happen to dine at the same tavern that Brienne and Pod are resting at, who both of them are now on the hunt for Sansa to protect her as part of the vow that Brienne made to Lady Catelyn, like way back in Season 2. And Brienne decides to confront Littlefinger and Sansa and try to sway her to come with them, and clearly she fails. Sansa does not know who Brienne is and doesn't trust her at all, and ends up staying with Littlefinger and sends Brienne and Pod away. So Sansa is on her way somewhere with Littlefinger, we don't know where, and Brienne and Pod decide to follow them in the hopes of getting close enough to Sansa to be able to convince her to trust them, and in the end save her from a fate that we do not know yet. Littlefinger later reveals that he's bringing Sansa to Winterfell in order to wed her to Roose Bolton's no longer a bastard, creepy, murderous son, Ramsay. And she basically is very unhappy about this, happy to be back at Winterfell, unhappy to be marrying the man that is taking over her home, essentially. And after some bitching and complaining, she finally settles in with the idea, realizes that this is going to be her opportunity for revenge on her family, and agrees to marry agrees to marry Ramsay. Meanwhile, Theon, who's now called Reek, he has seen and recognized Sansa, obviously, and is terrified that she is going to see him and hurt him further for supposedly killing her two little brothers, which we know to be untrue because Bran is at the wall, or beyond the wall, looking for the three-eyed raven, and Rickon is somewhere with the wildling Osha, hiding in the woods in safety. After settling into the castle, Sansa is approached by a servant who tells her that, quote, the North remembers. And this is kind of a way for the show to show that Sansa has support from the staff and the locals, and that they will always back the Stark in Winterfell no matter who actually is holding Winterfell. Which gives Sansa a little bit of comfort, and you can kind of see the things ticking through her mind. You know, what is she going to be able to do later on down the road to save herself? Now, meanwhile, in the village down the road from Winterfell, Brienne and Pod are waiting for an opportunity to get a message to Sansa, and they just so happen to encounter an old man delivering their food who may just be the ticket. This plotline's kind of left unfinished because I think next week we're going to really go into Brienne and Pod getting to Sansa somehow. And while all this is happening, Ramsay and his mistress, Miranda, who is the kennel master, the dog breeder's daughter, they're having a bit of a tiff because Ramsay's now engaged to Sansa and therefore can't marry Miranda. And I don't think he would have done that anyway because as the heir to Roose Bolton's castle and lineage, he would have to marry someone of good birth anyway, and Miranda is way too lowborn for any of that to go down. But anyway, they argue it out for a bit, then they bang and everything's fine, I guess, so whatever. He's still creepy, and we don't like him. And then Miranda, a little bit later on in the episode, lures Sansa into the kennels where Reek is sleeping in order to stir up some trouble and hopefully get Reek in more trouble and get Sansa in trouble. This is left very unclear as to why she's actually doing it other than jealousy. But Sansa's super classy. She just walks away from the scene. And Reek is obviously terrified. And then Ramsay attempts to do the exact same thing at dinner by rubbing Theon's presence in Sansa's face. Unfortunately, that doesn't go over very well either, and Roose Bolton reveals that he and his really fat wife, Walda, are expecting a baby, and that they're anticipating it to be a boy, which would essentially usurp Ramsay's presence in the castle, forcing him out. He's no longer the heir. He's very upset, because a true-born heir is better than a bastard heir, regardless of who says he's legitimized or not. So he'd be thrown out of the castle, and the legit heir from Walda, birthed in wedlock, would be the new heir to Winterfell. So Ramsay does not like that, but Roose essentially comforts Ramsay by telling him that he's more of a son than any man on earth possibly could be or ever will be, because they're both murderous rapists and like to torture people. Great. Anyway, moving on. We're introduced this season to a new location named Dorne. Now, we were a little bit familiar with this country from last season. Prince Oberyn Martell, who unfortunately was murdered by the Mountain during a trial by combat for Tyrion in Season 4. Unfortunately, this is his country. We're introduced at this moment to his lover, Alaria, who has a super awful haircut right now, trying to convince Prince Oberyn's brother, Doran Martell, that they need to go to war against the Lannisters, against King Landing, so that they can essentially rip from the Lannisters what was ripped from them when Oberyn was murdered. Now, in defense, Ellaria Sand tries to convince Doran Martell to go to war, and he says no, absolutely not. They're protecting Myrcella, which is Cersei's daughter, and Myrcella is set to wed Doran's heir Trystane. Ellaria Sand then gathers her daughters, 3 of them, affectionately nicknamed the Sand Snakes, and they decide to plot against Doran and go to war with the Lannisters and with King's Landing in Oberyn Martell's name, because she's dumb and her haircut's dumb, and she doesn't realize that it's probably going to get her and all of her daughters murdered. And that's all for Doran for now. Now, moving on to King's Landing, a lot is going on at the same time here. We see young King Tommen and Queen Margaery get quietly and very happily married. There's very little fanfare in the city. And after coming from the Sept of Baelor, where they got married, Cersei and Jaime notice that there are many barefooted preaching priests, or we call them septons, in the streets praising the 7 gods of their religion and condemning Queen Cersei and her bastard children. Cersei's own cousin Lancel approaches her, and he's the one that she used to bang way back in season 1, and he poisoned the king, Robert, and he died. All of that's tied in here. And Lancel has now become one of these priests, and they call these priests sparrows. So he's extremely pious right now and very righteous, and knows that he's committed sins beyond his own redemption, and that Cersei has as well, and that she should beg forgiveness for the gods for her immortal soul, which she laughs off and calls him crazy, basically, and she dismisses him as a dumbass who knows nothing. Later on that week, Margaery and Tommen sex it up a lot, which is really gross. And Margaery makes it very plain to Cersei that Cersei's been replaced on the throne as queen and in Tommen's life, and that she should basically move her wrinkly old ass out of the castle. Poor Cersei is visibly upset at this, and in typical Cersei fashion, sets out for revenge, and finds it with the barefooted sparrows that are preaching all over the city. She kind of has a plan in mind, but we don't know exactly what it is yet. She ends up tracking down the leader of the sparrows, who they've called the High Sparrow, and begins to bring him under her influence. She grants him the right to reinstate the Holy Army, which is an army dedicated to following only the commands of the gods, or in this case, the commands of the High Sparrow, who speaks on behalf of the gods. And the Sparrow army then finds the current High Priest in a brothel, sexing it up, which is totally illegal for priests to do. And then they beat him and push him naked through the city all the way back to the castle, where Queen Cersei dismisses him completely. He's fired, he's no longer the High Septon, and everybody hates him, basically. Then, meanwhile, Cersei and Jaime are having an argument over getting Myrcella back from Dorne, and in the end, she forces Jaime to kind of go on his own, because he's no good doing anything else in the castle with his own one hand missing. So he sets out with Bronn, who's Tyrion's old fighting buddy, and the two of them go out to Dorne to get Myrcella. They make it all the way to the shores of Dorne before they're set upon by some Dornish soldiers. They win that battle, surprisingly enough, because they only have 3 hands between them, and continue on their way. The plotline is left a little unfinished. The rest of the season will probably play out and show us what's happening. Now, back in King's Landing, Cersei is beginning to unfurl her plan to bring down Margaery using the High Sparrow and his army. This plotline is also really left hanging. Unfortunately, I think it's going to take some time to draw this one out, but Cersei is going to see some struggles down the road.